Hey y'all, it's Heel Heat time.
Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles and this is an episode of It Came From the Network. Now on It Came From the Network we review the weird, the wild, the campy, and sometimes just downright bad stuff that you can find all on the WWE Network. This one comes from a suggestion from one of our friends, Steve Tatanani, and it's Great American Bash from WCW 1991. Let's jump right into it with the first match of the night. A scaffold match with Bobby Eaton and PN News versus Stunning Steve Austin and the computerized man of the future, Terrence Taylor. You're going to see a little bit of a pattern arrive here, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, but just follow for the pattern as you see. We get two or three extremely great wrestlers in Eaton, Taylor, and Austin. Taylor, very underrated guy. He could go. Kind of got hindered by the Red Rooster gimmick a little bit, but he was actually a really good wrestler. Steve Austin, obviously, became Steve Austin. Bobby Eaton, one of the great wrestlers of the 80s and 90s. PN News, he was good for a big guy. Part of the couple of things that really hurt this match was the fact, A, there was a scaffold match with little or no heat to it. No build-up, no anger, no animosity. Also, the fact that the scaffold was probably about as wide as PN News, so you couldn't really move around much. So it was very boring, very, cautious, which by all means they should be. 20, 30 feet above a ring and concrete, you're going to be as cautious as you can. Matter of fact, at one point PN News knocks Taylor and Austin into the one side of the scaffolding and the whole thing shakes. Also, unlike other scaffold matches in the past where the goal was to knock your opponent off, you basically captured the flag and then brought it back to your side, which is how Bobby Eaton won. He took the flag and took it to the face side, and then they continued to fight for about another minute and a half before the ring announcer realized that they won. It was just weird, bad match, a lot of stalling, a lot of very carefulness, which, again, to be expected with the kind of match it is. The matches with the Road Warriors and Midnight Express earlier, and a couple other scaffold matches they did a little bit better on because they made the scaffold about 5-6 feet wide where you could actually walk around a little bit and move a bit. This one, it was left to punches and kicks and just a boring match to start off the show. Eaton and PN News pick up the win. Then there's a little fracas in the ring. The faces chase away Keller and Austin. Just a weird opener. And then they have to take down the scaffold, because later on in the night we're going to have a cage match, or actually two cage matches. Next up we have the Diamond Stud, aka Razor Ramon, aka Scott Hall, with his manager Diamond Dallas Page versus the Zman, who formerly was known as Tom Zink. This again, another match, probably looked really good on paper. Z-Man, Tom Zink was kind of the, how should I put this, almost like the Kofi Kingston of his era. Very popular with kids, very, very solid in the ring, not so great on the microphone. A guy that could have pretty decent matches with almost anybody. Diamond Stud picks up the win with a back suplex. You've seen a little bit of the Razor Ramon coming out of him. He wasn't quite there yet. But, hey, this is an early match for a couple of the greats in our industry. This was before DDP started actually wrestling. So it was a good precursor of stuff to come. Next up, we have Oz, who went on to become Diesel, and then Kevin Nash, versus Ron Simmons, who eventually became Farouk, but more successful as Ron Simmons, where he actually became a world champion. This, again, a quintessential big man match of the time. Very boring, very lumbering. Nash had his hair dyed gray, which he wouldn't have to do if he had to give it now. Was a play off of, if you couldn't tell, The Wizard of Oz. He came in a full wizard regalia. Had a guy named the Wizard who was basically just Kevin Sullivan with a weird looking mask on him. I don't know, Ron Simmons picks up the win after 3 shoulder blocks, which was pretty much a staple of his repertoire. They played heavily on his football career. This was a bad match, just not really great, not really fun, very lumbering. Next up, we have Robert Gibson versus Richard Morton, aka formerly Ricky Morton of the Rock and Roll Express with Robert Gibson. At this point, Morton had turned heel and became part of the York Foundation. This was another match that probably, on paper, looked really great. One of the great tag teams of the 1980s, the Rock and Roll Express, finally going head-to-head. There should have been a lot more animosity in the match. It should have been a lot more violent. It should have been a lot more hatred. There really wasn't, though. It felt like a normal, kind of a Clash of Champions kind of match. Morton picks up the win when the ref is distracted, and he uses Alexandria York, who would go on to become Marlena and then Terry Runnels. He uses her laptop, which at the time, in the early 1990s, laptops were about 20 pounds. He used it to pick up the win, hitting Gibson in his injured knee. Just a bad match. It probably could have been a lot better if they gave more to the feud. Next up, we have the Freebirds and Bad Street, and to be noted, this version of the Freebirds was Michael P.S. Hayes and Jimmy Jam Garvin. Sorry. Not the previous version with Michael Hayes, Buddy Roberts, and Bam Bam Terry Gordy. This was towards the end of the Freebird run. Garvin, who up until that point became known as was considered the 4th Freebird for constantly tagging with him and being an ally, he actually became an official member. Bad Street was Brad Armstrong under a mask. Kind of a bad, weird gimmick. And they wrestled against the Young Pistols, who was Steve Armstrong, Brad's brother, and Tracy Smothers, with a very young Dusty Rhodes before he would go on to become Goldust. This was an alright match, an elimination match. Dustin Rhodes picks up the win at the end with the Bulldog. Kind of, I wish this match would have got a little bit more time because it was better than everything leading up to it at this point. Probably one of the better matches on the card. Still not a great match, but still a serviceable match. Something that on a card with a lot more better matches probably would have stood out and made better sense. Next up, we have Yellow Dog, aka Brian Pillman under a yellow mask because at the time he was suspended, versus Johnny B. Bad, who would go on to be Mark Marrow with Teddy Long. This was I believe this was Johnny B. Bad's first pay-per-view match. It may have been one of his first matches. Decent match between the two, nothing really special. Yellow Dog picks up the win where he's going for the pin and Teddy Long comes in and causes a disqualification. Again, decent, not great. Par for the course for the show we're having so far. Nothing really exciting happened. Nothing of note. Nothing that went down in the annals of wrestling history other than an embarrassing part of Brian Pillman's career where he wrestled as Yellow Dog. Next up we have Big Josh, who would be formerly known as Maniac Matt Bourne and then eventually go on to be the original Doink, versus Black Blood, who was Billy Jack Haynes under a wrestling mask. Now we're starting to see, if you haven't picked up by now, there's a couple of themes running through the show. One of the themes is kind of a before they were superstars theme. You got guys like Steve Austin before he was Stone Cold, Razor Ramon, Scott Hall when he was the Diamond Stud, DDP when he was still a manager, Kevin Nash as Oz, Dustin Rhodes before he played Goldust where he became more successful. Then you also had another theme of guys that are better known as other things under masks. The Wizard with Oz actually being Kevin Sullivan, Bad Street, Brad Armstrong, Yellow Dog, Brian Pillman, and now Black Blood, who was Billy Jack Haynes. This was a lumberjack match building on Big Josh's expertise as a lumberjack. Of course, Big Josh picks up the win. Not a terrible match. Again, pretty much a ho-hum kind of card filler. This would be a good match on Monday Nitro, or at the time Saturday night, or whatever show at the time. Not really a pay-per-view, especially not a Great American Bash worthy match. Coming up after that, we have if it wasn't for the scaffold match, this would be the worst match of the night. And that was El Gigante versus the One-Man Gang. All you need to know about El Gigante is he was 7'8", and he made the Great Khali look like Rey Mysterio. This was a terrible, terrible match. One-Man Gang, a great wrestler I have a lot of admiration for, a guy that I really enjoyed watching as a young guy, as a kid, and into my teenage years, and even my adult years. El Gigante just never had anything that transferred into a wrestling ability, which is kind of weird because he was a professional basketball player, so he had athletic ability, just could never make it work. El Gigante picks up the win, and I don't know. Next up, we have Nikita Koloff versus Sting in a Russian chain match, which is kind of like the same as a bull rope match. You'd have to touch all four corners to win. This had a nice heat, nice backstory to it. Koloff had attacked Sting a few times leading up to the match. On paper, it looked like this was going to be a great match. In the ring, as a lot of times happened with chain matches, there was a lot of stalling, a lot of boredom, a lot of touching three corners and then getting attacked. You know, we get the finish where Koloff wins, kind of very similar to the Eddie Guerrero versus JBL match where Guerrero won by following JBL and then getting the last corner before he won. I don't know, to me, these two should have had a better match. This should have been much more important. Sting actually should have went into the next match, which we're going to talk about a little bit when we get into that. But, just a boring match. The chain matches don't really go over so well. It takes a special talent. Guerrero and JBL had a good one. Roddy Piper versus Greg Valentine is the benchmark from Starrcade 1983. A match that now is 32 years old, and I guarantee if you've never seen it, go back and watch it. It's all Starrcade 83 is on the network. Go watch that match. It holds up. 32 years later, it could be put into the current product and still have the fans looking at it like it was an amazing match. That's how good that was. This one, not so much. And it's surprising because Koloff and Sting both were excellent wrestlers. Arguably in the peak of Koloff's career, this was the beginning of the peak of Sting's career. Sting would go on after this to have a fabulous run for the next 10 to 15 years. He was one of the top guys in wrestling. Koloff was towards the end. He retired, I think, a little bit early, in my opinion. But I wanted more from this than I got, and it was just not as good as what I thought it should have been. Next match was the first of two cage matches. This one was for the vacated World Heavyweight Championship, which up until 2 weeks before the show was held by Ric Flair. Now, this was the time when Ric Flair jumped to WWE and brought the Real World Championship to WWE, which was the NWA title, which he actually owned. He bought and commissioned the big gold belt that's synonymous with WCW and NWA at the time as their world championship. Flair owned that belt. Thing of it was, they stripped him of it. Now, they put Barry Windham and Lex Luger in the match, two great competitors. In my opinion, they probably should have thrown Sting and Luger in there. Sting, coming off, was a few months earlier a world champion, gave a little bit more credibility. At this point, neither Windham or Luger had been a world champion. Luger was the U.S. champion, and most notably for the past 2 to 3 years, failed at capturing the World Championship from Ric Flair. The match is marred by the fans chanting, "We want Flair, we want Flair." For whatever reason, WCW even went to a camera shot with the cameraman looking right at a group of fans yelling, "We want Flair." I have no idea why they didn't cut from that. You don't want to expose the fact that your most popular wrestler just jumped ship, that he's in the WWF. And rumors are that they wanted to give him a lowball contract and make him not as big as he was at the time, which he was the world champion, the flagship of the show. They wanted to diminish his role a bit and give him less money. He jumped to WWE. The rest is history. Luger picks up the win and does a heel turn that no one really understands because there wasn't really heel tactics in it other than the fact that Mr. Hughes and Harley Race came down to ringside and Harley told him to hit him with the pile driver. Nothing heel really about a manager telling you a move to do. Now, if you would have gave him a stack of quarters to hit him with, a chain to hit him with, threw powder in his eye, maybe. But, I don't know, it was just, the match itself was decent. It took about 5 minutes to get it warmed up, and then we had about another 5 minutes of a good match. The last 3 minutes were really good. Probably the best match of the night, but that's not saying a lot considering I think I could put on a match that was better than any match on this card, and I have no professional wrestling training, as you can tell by my build. I'm not very athletic at all, but this is what we had. And in a perplexing situation, the World Championship Steel Cage match, which originally was going to be Luger versus Flair, turned to be Wyndham versus Luger, that should have got top billing, did not. The top billing went to a mixed tag match with Paulie Dangerously and Arn Anderson versus Rick Steiner and Missy Hyatt. Originally it was going to be Paulie, Arn, and Wyndham versus Steiner Brothers and Missy Hyatt. However, Scott got injured, so Wyndham was pulled from the match to make the sides even. On the way to the match, Missy Hyatt gets abducted by Dick Slater and Dick Murdoch. So we have a handicap match, Rick Steiner versus Paulie and Arn. Match lasted about 2 minutes. Rick Steiner gets the best of Arn. Paulie gets in. He hits Paulie with a Steiner line. We got the win, and that's your main event. Your main event of the night is won by Rick Steiner clotheslining Paulie Dangerously, who would go on to be Paul Heyman, the cult leader of ECW and the advocate for Brock Lesnar. To recap everything, we had a lot of before they were stars. The Diamond Stud, Oz, Big Josh before he became Doink, Dustin Rhodes before his tremendous run as Goldust, Sting before Sting was popular. He was probably still in the build to be the biggest guy in the world. Steve Austin before he became Stone Cold. Just a weird and a bad pay-per-view. Probably one of the worst I've watched. Probably one of the worst wrestling shows I've ever watched. And I'm going to go into our ratings. We have a 1 to 5 scale. 5 being the best, 1 being the worst. 1 is a Gobbledygooker, 2 is a Renegade, 3 is a Hurricane Helms, 4 is a Goldust, and 5 is Kane. Giving the show a 1, a Gobbledygooker. Like I said, probably one of the worst put together wrestling shows in concept, in theory, in execution. Just bad all the way across the board. I do not recommend watching anything from the show unless you're just a glutton for punishment, which I guess I am. This is one of the most historically bad shows, marred by bad booking matches, bad gimmick matches, Ric Flair leaving 2 weeks before in the build-up, which at the time they would take 4 weeks to build. Just bad all the way around, just nothing enjoyable about it. And to make that stick out even worse, this was a 2 hour and 40 something minute show. I had to watch it over 3 days, piece by piece, because I got so bored with it that I would have to turn it off and go watch something else and come back to it, just so I could review it for this show. But basically, that's what I have to say about that. Steve, the show was for you. Thank you for your suggestion. Next time, try and give me something a little bit better. And for all you guys out there that want to see a specific show, a pay-per-view, anything you want me to do to maybe a top 10 list or something that you think I should put on It Came From the Network, let me know what you think. Hit me up on Facebook, hit me up on Twitter, put it down where? Down in the comments. And I'll try and get to it. If I can do it, I'll do it. If not, I'll tell you I can't. But Steve, this one's for you. Thank you for letting me watch, or suggestion, this terrible, terrible pay-per-view. We're still friends. I still consider you a good guy, even though you did that to me. But that's basically what I have to say about that. My name is George Coles, and this has been another episode of It Came From the Network.